Okay, so today's daf is daf kaf, number 20 in Eruvin. And we're going to start on the first line of daf kaf Amud Aleph, where we started this perek. For those who are following the daf on their own, would have started it on Yom Tov, on the first day of Pesach. And the second day of Pesach, the first two dapim of this perek. This perek, Osin Pasin, is speaking about something that we've alluded to several times in the Masekhet already, which was that they had a situation where they would have a well in the public area, and in order to take water from the well to either give water to their animals or to drink, they would have to take it from what was effectively a private domain, because the well itself had dimensions of a private domain, into a public domain where they were standing. And so what the rabbis allowed them to do was to make a kind of an enclosure, but all they did was enclose the corners. So they would basically have let's say the northwest corner would have a board of an amma facing to the east and a board of an amma facing to the south. And the northeast corner would have a board of an amma facing west and a board of an amma facing south. And so basically each corner had an amma facing at right angles at each corner. And so this was called the Pasei Beraot, the boards of the wells, because this is how they would get around the problem of extracting water from wells. That's what Osin Pasin is about. That's the main subject of this perek. We also ended up missing, unfortunately, 2 pages of really great Agadah that were on the past two dapim had wonderful agadot. But anyway, we're going to start from the very first line, last word of the first line of daf kaf. Ba'amine abaye merabah. This is actually the continuation of a sugya that started towards the top of the previous amud, which is why we're not starting it at the beginning, because we would have to do an entire daf and a half to do it. Of Abaye asking Rabbah several questions about this case of the Pasei Beraot. So we're going to see what happens here. So his question is, Chatzer sherosha nichnas leben hapasin. Ma'u letatel nitocha leben hapasin? O mi ben hapasin letocha. Let's say you have a situation where a chatzer, now remember, these wells are outside of any enclosure. That's why you have to make these corner pieces to enclose them. So the well is right outside of a chatzer, but the only thing is, it's not quite right outside of a chatzer, because the chatzer entrance penetrates into this enclosure. So you made an enclosure with the corners around your well, but it so happens that the opening of the enclosed courtyard empties right into your little enclosure without any space in between. In other words, it actually penetrates through. So can you carry from the Pasei Beraot, can you carry from within your enclosure to the courtyard? Since there's an overlap, you should be able to carry from this enclosure with the well into the courtyard. Shouldn't be a problem, right? There's no space that you are not allowed to carry through. You don't have to go through the public domain to get from your well area to the courtyard, because they overlap. So let me see if they have a picture here of that. Do they have a picture?
There's a picture, yeah.
I don't see one. Oh, yeah, I see. You're right. Yeah, here's a picture. Here's a picture also on illustration number 131. These are the Pasei Beraot. These are the corner pieces. Here's the opening of the courtyard. So the opening of the courtyard, when you walk out of the courtyard, basically, you walk right into this enclosure that's surrounding the wells on the 4 corners, okay? You see? 4 corners, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well,
so this
opening of
right up to the wall.
Yeah, it's right up to the wall. So you walk in. So the problem here is not a problem, by the way, of going from a public domain to a private domain, because everybody agrees there's no public domain here. You're going right from your enclosed well area right into your courtyard. There's no stepping into a public domain. What's the problem? The problem is Eruvei Chatzerot. We know you can't go from one chatzer to another. You can't even go from one courtyard to another unless they've made an eruv between them. They have to have made some kind of a joining of the 2 chatzerot to allow them to carry from one chatzer to another, because each one is considered its own domain. Even though physically there's no interruption, residentially speaking, the well is enclosed by people encamping outside the courtyard. They're not people who live in the courtyard. And the people in the courtyard are their own independent entity. So from a social standpoint, you could say, in other words, from a residential standpoint, these are two different domains. Even though physically, there's no point where you're actually stepping from a private to a public domain. Okay?
But you can't do it because you have to do it through a shituf, and you can't do a shituf with a well.
Well, they didn't make... Well, there are people out there who are using the well. So could those people did not make an eruv with the people who live in the chatzer, that's for sure. So the question is, do they prohibit now carrying back and forth from this area to the chatzer? So the Gemara says, Amar, they said to him, Mutar, you're allowed to carry back and forth. Why? What's the reason? So Rashi explains that basically, since the people living outside are not really considered dwellers, they're not really considered to have their own domain because they're just temporarily camped out there. These people who are using this well are just camped outside the walls of the chatzer. They're not really living there. So we don't say, oh, it's like having two chatzerot, it's like having two courtyards with two separate sets of dwellers who prohibit one another from carrying. Here, these people are just transient. They're not really dwelling there, so they don't forbid the people in the chatzer from carrying into their back and forth from their area. Now, Amar, so then he asked him, Shetayim Mai, what if two chatzerot open into the pasin? Two chatzerot open. So,
that's what this.
Okay. So so just have a picture there. Show us the picture. What does the picture show us? When you have two courtyards, right? So the entrance to the two courtyards is very close to one another. Okay. Let's say the west side of one courtyard and the east side of the other courtyard are next to each other. They both spill out into this pasei beraot enclosure, right into the well enclosure. Okay. So the question is now, do we have a problem? Because using that, since these two chatzerot cannot carry from one to the other. So if they both can carry into this enclosed well area and back and forth from their courtyard to this enclosed well area, in a way they're sharing a space, because now they're sharing this space in between them. They're sharing the this well space. So is that a problem? We know if they share, let's say, a mavoi, for example, they would have to make a special shituf. They can't have an alley that they share without making an arrangement. What about this pasei beraot? Can a person in chatzer A, let's say, carry his stuff in and out of that enclosure, and a person from chatzer B also carry his stuff in and out from that enclosure? Now,
what would that be different? Because what would that change anything?
It makes it more complicated, because if you just had one chatzer opening to the pasei beraot, so you could say, well, the people who are using that well are not really permanent residents there, so they don't interfere with the courtyard people's ability to go to and fro. But if you have two chatzerot using opening to that same well area, they have an issue with each other because they're both permanent residents of their respective chatzerot. So now you're kind of mixing the chatzerot through this well area. That's the problem. So the Gemara says, in that case, Amar le asur. He said they can't both go back and forth from these pasei beraot, because it's in a way it's like these two chatzerot are sharing an area, and they're not allowed to do that. Amar Rav Huna says, Shetayim asurin vafilu ervu gezerah shemayamru eruv mo'il leben pasin. That the Rav Huna says, I'm going to go even further. Even if these two chatzerot have an eruv between them, in other words, even if they have, let's say, a shared entrance somewhere, this wouldn't count as a shared entrance because these are two independent entrances. Mm-hmm. But let's say that somewhere in the wall separating these two chatzerot, somewhere in a wall separating the two chatzerot, there's a way to go back and forth between the two chatzerot, so they made an eruv. Remember, if two chatzerot don't have any entrance that goes between them, they can't make an eruv, they're totally independent. Once they have an entrance that goes back and forth between the two of them, they can make an eruv and unite. The only thing is, what might happen if these two chatzerot make an eruv, or they have an eruv, because they have another shared door that goes directly from chatzer A to chatzer B. So then if they were to share the well area out in front of the two chatzerot, people might make a mistake and say that's considered a shared entrance between chatzer A and chatzer B. Because look, person from chatzer A, that the well area, they're going to think that person from chatzer A can step out of his chatzer into the well area, go around the wall, and go into chatzer B. That's like having a shared area.
That would be
and that's not true. That's not considered having a shared entrance. A shared entrance is only an entrance that goes directly from chatzer A to chatzer B through the wall.
So
here they don't have that.
The only reason why you would not be able to do this is because the way that the well is enclosed is in a way that's specific to the well itself, but it doesn't count for.
That's not the issue. They're not giving us a problem. They're not even giving us that problem.
There's no eruv between the two.
The two chatzerot don't have a. But he's saying even if they had an eruv, they still can't carry via this well area because people would make a mistake and think that's the common entrance, and would think that even two chatzerot that don't have a common entrance, we can make an enclosure here and create a common entrance.
So they couldn't make a kosher eruv because
they could because they actually had.
That's not a kosher common entrance.
That's not considered a common entrance because it's actually just two entrances opening to a common area.
So
it's not really.
Be.
Right, but even if they have a common entrance somewhere else that's not shown in the picture, people might make a mistake and say, oh, that counts as a common entrance, the front part. And it doesn't. So that's what Rav Huna says. However, Rava Amar Eruv Mutar. Rava disagrees with this and says, you know what, if they have an Eruv between the two of them, because they have another shared entrance somewhere, then it's okay for them both to share this Pasei Bera'ot thing in the front too. Amar le Abaye le Rava. Abaye said to Rava, Tanya de Misayalach. There's actually a braita that supports you. Chatzer sherosh hayachad nichnas lebena pasin. That if you have a chatzer that one of its heads, one of its sides opens in between these pasei beraot, mutar letaltel mitocha lebena pasin or mibena pasin letocha. You can go in and out from this enclosed well area to the courtyard. Aval shitayim asur. But if there are two chatzerot that open to this pasei beraot, then they can't both use. Neither of them can use it, basically, in that case. Bamed divarim amurim. When is this true? Shelo eruvu, aval eruvu mutarim. It says as if the two chatzerot don't have an eruv between them. But if the two chatzerot have an eruv between them, in one of their walls, there's actually a door that goes from Chatzer Aleph to Chatzer Bet, and therefore they have an eruv between them to allow carrying to go on between the two. Then they can also allow carrying to go on from Chatzer Aleph to the Pasei Beraot, the well area, and from well area to the second Chatzer, and so on. But doesn't this actually refute Rav Huna? Because this braita is explicitly saying that if the two Chatzerot have an eruv, it's no problem. That they can both share the well area. And he said even if they had an eruv, they could not. Because people will make a mistake and think that the well area is the shared entrance. So the answer is, Amar lach Rav Huna, hatam dehadran ve'arevan. What it's talking about here is that there's another opening that they share. Okay? So Rashi says, Shenifritza benehen pirza gedola bisofa shegaloi lakol shereshut ahati. So there's an illustration though of what this means, that there's another opening. In other words, that they have the illustration that it shows here in the Rashi here is that this is the Pasei Beraot. This is the well area. Mm-hmm. This is Chatzer Aleph and Chatzer Bet. They're separated by this line in the middle. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, they both open, respectively, to the well area, right? But they're separated by a wall. But in the back, they have also an opening from both of them. They have an entrance that's actually for both of them. That you could see that they're all really one thing, just separated by a wall. They're all really one chatzer separated by a wall, because on the other side, you could see an opening where you look right into both of them.
Right, so how can they have a roof on
right?
that?
No, they do, because you could see that they have a door. See, it says petach. They have a door between the two of them.
Ah, okay.
See, so they have three things. They both open into the well area. They have a shared door directly between the two of them in their wall, and you can see on the other end right in.
Mm-hmm.
But it's got to be the other end, so that will
take care of it
people
from misunderstanding that just having a well area in the front where they both spill into is enough to make it considered one.
I have a question.
Connected.
When they're talking about having a eruv, are they talking about having a shitufei chatzerot with a eruv or individual?
Eruv means that they make a shituf between the two of them with bread. They take bread.
What they're talking about, because they could have a eruv. This one may have a eruv in this.
Independently for their personal residence.
So they're always talking about shitufei chatzerot.
They're talking about connected. It's called eruvei chatzerot.
Okay.
That could either be within one chatzer or also across chatzerot. To unite the two chatzerot into one chatzer also would count. So, or here, the way that they have it in this illustration in number 134 is that in the back, see, there's an opening of the two. This is Chatzer 1, Chatzer 2. In the back, it's open, and in the front, the two entrances. See, from here, from the perspective of the wells, it looks like they're two separate places opening into the wells. But from the back, you could see. If you're in Chatzer Aleph or Chatzer Bet, you would see that actually they're united spatially.
But aren't we worried? The people making
they have a door and they have an
worried about people out here making.
No, we're not. We're not worried about somebody making a mistake like this just on the fly that they walk by and they see it because they're going to make a mistake. They're going to make a more universal mistake. Yeah, they're not going to. They're going to think, we can construct a Chatzer in another case where we don't need to have this door in between us. We'll just have a well in front. So that has two entrances that open to the same enclosure. That should be enough, even if it's totally separate. So that wouldn't be allowed. That's what Rav Huna says. Now, Abaye asked Rabbah another question. What happens if the well dries up on Shabbat? I hate when that happens. Amar said to him, he said, what's the whole reason why the rabbis allowed you to make this corner piece type of enclosure that doesn't really have walls? The reason is because of the well. When there's no well, there's no mechitza. So if the water dries up, it's no good anymore. It's kind of like what we learned on Erev Pesach about if the number of people, if one of the people leaves, so that eliminates the whole institution of the mechitza. Ravin asked the following question. What happens if the water dries up, but then it comes back? So the flow of water had stopped. But then it was prohibited to carry within the Pasei Bera'ot because that special corner piece leniency only is for a well. But then somehow the well started flowing again. Amar le Abai says, don't ask about when it dried up because I already asked the master, meaning I already asked Rabbah, and he told me that if the water dries up, it's no good. And you shouldn't ask about when the water comes back either. Why? Because it's just like a wall made on Shabbat. V'tanyan, we learned in a Braita called Mechitza Asuyah b'Shabbat b'Mishogeg b'Mezid ben be'ones ben b'Ratzon. We learned that any mechitza that's made on Shabbat, whether it was on purpose or by accident, whether it was be'ones, against our will, b'Ratzon, with our will. In other words, what it's trying to say is it doesn't matter if it was an intentional, unintentional, against your will, willingly, it doesn't matter. Shemach mechitza. It counts as a mechitza. It doesn't matter how it got there. The fact is, if the enclosure is there, the enclosure is there. Okay? And what that means is that so too here. We don't care how the water was gone. The water came. Now the water's here. So the enclosure's back. In other words, it can happen on Shabbat. An enclosure can come into being on Shabbat. And we don't say because the physical enclosure wasn't there at the beginning of Shabbat that it's not there now. We look at the reality. So too. We don't say that because the water dried up, that it's now if the water comes back, it's not going to work. When the water comes back, it's like the enclosure is reinstated.
Yeah, but the problem is that this type of enclosure only works for the well. That's the exception for the well itself.
So he's looking at it that it's as if when there's no water, there's no enclosure. When the water comes, the enclosure comes. Right? That's how he's looking at it. So he says, "V'lavit mar ala," but was it not stated about this? Amar Rav Nachman, "Lo shanu el lizrok aval litaltil lo." Didn't Rav Nachman say this is only true with regard to throwing, but not carrying? What does that mean, throwing and not carrying? What that means is, whenever it says throwing, what it means is if you throw from a public domain into this enclosure, you're hayav, you're liable. In other words, he's saying le'isur. We say that any mechitza that comes into existence on Shabbat is considered a real mechitza because we have to be strict. In other words, if it's enclosed, it's enclosed. But litaltel, nobody said you could carry in that enclosure that didn't exist before Shabbat. You can't carry in that enclosure. It's only that if you threw from the public to the private domain to the enclosed domain, you'd be liable. So the Gemara answers, ki itmar de Rav Nachman amezid itmar. Rav Nachman was only talking about the mezid. If a person intentionally sets up mechitzot on Shabbat, we don't say, oh, now you can carry in that enclosure. We recognize it as an enclosure that you can't move something from the public domain inside it. But we don't tell you can carry in an enclosure that was put into place on purpose on Shabbat. In this case, though, did you put the water back in the well on Shabbat? No, it came by itself. So if it came by itself, no problem. It reinstates the enclosure. And an enclosure that comes into existence on Shabbat is an enclosure. That's what Abaye says. Amar, yeah.
What happened if the well dried up? So what's the problem?
Because this enclosure is not a real enclosure. It only is they allowed you to use it only to take water from the well. So if there's no water in the well, you can't use it. The corner pieces, these corner pieces, they only help you if there's a well.
This only works for a well.
Those four corners.
Yeah. No, that's not really. It's a special thing that they let you create just to take water from the well.
It doesn't work for any.
It doesn't work for anything else. So if there's no water in the well, that's it.
What's the difference between these four?
And the lechayim, because lechayim is when you have 3 walls of a mavoi. You have 3 walls already, real walls, and just at the last wall you put a lechi. Here you have nothing, it's just open space, you just put 4 corners. Yeah, they're not, they look like it. But there's no structure at all. There's no structure, it's just corners. It's just like if you made...
Imaginary wall.
Yeah, it's imaginary. So it's just like demarcating the area almost. Amar Rabbi Elazar says, "Hazorek leben pasei bera'ot chayav." If you throw something from the public domain into this pasei bera'ot area, this enclosed area where the well is, chayav, you carried from a public to a private domain. In other words, what is he saying? Biblically speaking, this is a private domain. It has to be that way. It has to be that way. Right? It has to be that way. So. Pshita, this is obvious. If it were not really a mechitza, how could we allow the person to take from the well into this enclosure? Isn't the whole reason why we made this enclosure of the 4 corner pieces or the 8 pieces at right angles? Isn't the whole reason why we did that? In order to allow the person to move from a private domain, from the water in the well, into this enclosed area? That's the whole reason, right?
But that's only for these people, not for...
Yeah, but still, biblically, it must be viewed. Rabbinically, you're not allowed to carry in there...
It's like this for them, but not for everybody else.
Yeah, true, but that's only rabbinically. In other words, that has to only be a rabbinic stricture, that you're not allowed to carry within the pasei bera'ot except for the well. Because if it were biblically viewed as a public domain, you wouldn't be able to take out of the well at all. The rabbis can't just tell you, put some sticks in the ground and take out of the well, but
it
has to really be a reshut yachid. It has to really be defined biblically as a reshut yachid. Otherwise, you wouldn't.
Not just for them.
Not just for them. It's just that the rabbis are not going to let you use that strategy in any other case.
And
but
that finishing sticks for biblical purposes, even if the water dries out?
Yeah, for sure. Biblically, that's not going to matter. It's just that the rabbinic license to use it is going to be dependent on the water being there. But biblically, we can't take away its status as being a private domain. It wouldn't work at all if it were not biblically a private domain. Because then you'd just be taking from a private to a public domain by taking water out of the well, and that's certainly not allowed. Right? So that's what the Gemara says. Lo tzrichad avad ke'en pasei bera'ot bereshut harabim v'zarak l'toch hachayav. What it means is, let's say you didn't have a well and you just set up ke'en pasei bera'ot, which means you set up corner pieces. You went in the public domain. You said, I want to be able to carry in the public domain, so I'm going to make 4 corner pieces. On right angles. I'm going to make 8 pieces, put them on right angles, and amma each in 4 corners of my demarcated area, and I'm going to carry in there. You're not allowed to do that because there's no well. But what if I throw something from the public domain into that area that you created? Chayav, you're going to be liable. How do we know that? Because if it were not considered to be a private domain for other purposes biblically, then it wouldn't work for the well either. But the Gemara says again, Hanami pshita, ilav de ba'alma mechitahi, gabe borechi mishtere le'letaltele. How could it be that the Gemara says this is also obvious? Because if it were not for the fact that this corner piece setup works biblically in general, biblically it works, then how could the rabbis use it for the case of the well?
Right.
Of course it has to work. So then the Gemara says, Lo tzricha afal gav de kabak ebe rabim. That what the chidush here, why is Rabbi Elazar mentioning this? Because of a case where the people pass through it. Okay, that where people pass through, even though the public thoroughfare passes, people walk right through my pasei beraot. I said it's still considered a private domain. It doesn't matter that people walk through it. Once you have that set up, biblically it's viewed as a private domain. So umayka mashmalan dila'atu rabim mevatlei mechitzta. Why is Rabbi Eliezer saying this? To tell us that when, even though the public thoroughfare passes through, it's not considered to destroy the mechitza. That's what it says. That lo atu rabim, the people don't come umevatle mechitzta and nullify my wall. Because you might say, what kind of enclosure is it where the thoroughfare is going right through?
But biblically, a mechitza is a mechitza. According to Torah, you've got these
four corners,
no real wall, but it's still a mechitza for Torah.
Right, as long as it doesn't have 10 amot in between.
So how do the rabbis have the right to come along and say it's only a mechitza for the well?
Because they didn't want people to take it too far and come to carry in a public domain. So the rabbis. Well, no, so a lot of times, I mean, you could ask that about any case where the rabbis make a further restriction. Yeah, they're making a fence about it, because they're concerned that people will misunderstand. But you're right. Biblically, they can't rob it of its property of being a public domain. So, private domain. Didn't Rabbi Elazar already say this once? This idea that people passing through an enclosure doesn't nullify the enclosure. Ditnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer im hayta derech reshut rabim mafsaktan yisalaken letzadin v'chachamim rabim eno tarich. Because Rabbi Yehuda said that if the public passes through this enclosed area, you should move it to the side, so that it's not in the place where the public penetrates through. The rabbis say it's not necessary. For Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Damri Tarvayu, and Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar commented here and said that you see here the strength of mechitzot. Once you have an enclosed area, even if the public passes right through the enclosed area, we don't say that it stops being an enclosed area. Right? We don't say that. You see that the rabbis are saying you don't have to move it to the side, leave it in the middle. It doesn't matter. So why does Rabbi Elazar have to tell us this twice? He told us already in that context, commenting on that other Mishnah, that when you have an enclosed area, halachically enclosed, it doesn't matter that people walk through it. Why does he have to tell us again in the case of the well? Why is it necessary to tell us? So, mehatam hava amina kan velo sevirale. Ka mashmalan kan usvirale. Because you might have interpreted this comment as meaning, here the rabbis show you how strong they think mechitzot are. But I don't agree with it. So therefore it has to tell you that no, he agrees with it. So then fine, let him say it in our case where he's saying his own opinion, that an enclosed area can't be nullified by the passage of many people, and we'll know that he holds that way. We don't need him to say it twice. The reality is that one was inferred from the other. In other words, the two things were not independent statements. One was related to, inferred from, or derived from the other. Really, he only said it once. He made this point once. It was just reported in two different contexts. Once as an independent statement, and once as a commentary on this other Mishnah. So now the Gemara goes on to Nanhatam. We learned over there in a Mishnah. Lo ya'amod adam b'reshut harabim v'yishteh b'reshut hayachid. Okay, a person cannot stand in the public domain and drink in the private domain. He can't stand in the private domain and drink in the public domain. The problem is that if he leans over from the private to the public domain and he has a cup and he's drinking over there, or he leans from the public to the private domain and he has a cup and he's drinking over there, the concern is he's going to bring his cup with him from the place that he's drinking to the place where he's standing. So that's why the majority of his body has to be in the domain where he is drinking. And similarly, as we turn to Amud Bet, did we say about a wine press? Now, there's going to be a discussion of this later in the Gemara. We learned about this in Masekhet Shabbat, this exact same quote and the explanation, which isn't really discussed here in the Gemara because it's not relevant to our discussion per se, is that it's talking about a case of a wine press and the concerns of ma'aser. Before the processing of the wine is complete, you don't have to take ma'aser. Technically, you're allowed to eat from the wine while it's in the vat, while it's still being processed. You don't have to separate maaser because it's not complete yet. Yeah, it has to be complete. you're not allowed to sit down and have like a permanent kavua drinking of the untithed produce, but you can take a little bit of it while you're working. The measurement for what's considered not kavua, not doing it in a set way, is that the majority of your body is in the place of the wine press. In other words, you're actually leaning over the wine press with the majority of your body and taking a sip. You don't take from the wine press in a cup and go sit down somewhere, because that already looks like you are just benefiting from the untithed produce. But that's not relevant to us today. We're talking mainly about the drinking issue. So So we know with regard to a person that his head and the majority of his body have to be in the domain where he's drinking. What about an animal? Although, do we say that the animal that you bring your animal in between this enclosure, these pasei beraot, right? These pasei beraot, and you want the cow to drink from the well. So you're going to take water from the well and you're going to give it to your cow. Does the cow's head and majority of her body, have to be inside the enclosure? Or is it enough that, you are inside the enclosure, providing the water for your animal? So the Gemara says that any case where you are holding the vessel of the water and you're not holding the animal, don't even ask the question. Since you're not holding the animal, it might turn, it might move, and then you might move, holding the vessel of water from the private to the public domain. We don't want that to happen. But where should you ask a question? That everybody agrees that when you're holding the vessel but you're not holding the animal, that you have to have the head and the majority of the animal inside the enclosure, so you don't carry out. When should you ask the question? But if you're holding the animal, in other words, the animal's restrained and you're holding the trough or whatever it is that you're giving it water, you have both of them. So does the animal have to have its majority of its head and the majority of its body inside the enclosure in order to drink? So that's the question. So what's the halacha? He said to him, Tenitua, you already learned it. How so? It says already that the cow's head and the majority of its body have to be inside the enclosure for it to drink. We learned that already in a braita. It's clear. So isn't it talking about a case where you were restraining the animal and you were holding the vessel, and still it says that the animal has to have its majority inside the enclosure in order to give it to drink? No, we don't have to say that. Where does it say that the animal was restrained? Maybe it's talking about a case where the animal wasn't restrained. You're holding the water, the bucket of water. The animal's not restrained. It could move away. You're going to move with the animal by accident and carry out on Shabbat from that enclosure to the public area. But maybe when it's restrained, right? When you are, when it's restrained and you're holding the vessel, it's no problem. When it's not restrained, that's when it's saying that it has to be inside the enclosure. So but wait a second. Is there ever a case where if the animal's unrestrained and you're holding the vessel that you're allowed to give it to drink? How could we say that's the case where it's the majority if its head and the majority of its body are in the enclosure, that it's okay? It should never be okay to give to drink to an unrestrained animal. It always might move. Right? We learned in a braita, it says in another braita, a person should not fill a trough with water in front of his animal. Rather, he can fill his pitcher and pour out the water, and it will drink on its own accord. So what does that sound like? That sounds like he cannot be holding the vessel that the animal's drinking from.
So he won't follow the animal.
Right, so he won't follow the animal. He has to pour it out into something else and let the animal drink itself.
It sounds like if you're not directly involved in the feeding or the drink of the animal, then it's fine.
Well, you have to you can leave the water there and let the animal come get it. But
right.
You can't give it to drink
even if the animal goes out, drinks and comes back, that would be okay then.
That, the animal doesn't have to follow the halachot.
Right.
Yeah.
So the fact that it's yours, it
doesn't matter. Right. So, but what is it? This sounds like an unrestrained animal, though. You can never give it drink directly, right? You can always just pour it out in front of the animal if it's unrestrained. So how could that even be the issue? So ha'itmar Allah, no, because that's talking about a special case. Amar Abai says hacha be'evus ha'omed bereshut harabim gavua yud tefachim verochav dalet verosho echad nechnas leben hapasim. So what we're talking about here is a very, very specific case where you have an evus, you have a trough. This trough is in the public domain, but it has the dimensions of a private domain. It's 10 tefachim tall, and it's 4 amod wide. 4 tefachim wide, right? So it has the dimensions of a reshut hayachid. So the problem is, I think we have a picture of this. Hold on. So it's big enough to qualify as a reshut hayachid in its own right, even though it's in the reshut harabim. So the animal that's going to be drinking from it is going to be in a reshut harabim, where the actual trough is sitting. But the other end of the trough is inside the well enclosure. Why is that necessary? Because that's how you are going to be able to pour water into it. So you take water out of the well, which is a reshut hayachid, and you put it into the side of the trough, which is the reshut hayachid, because it itself is a reshut hayachid, the trough, and it's inside the reshut hayachid of the pasei beraot of the well area. Here it just shows right here. You can see. So you have this. So you have the cows here drinking. They're in the public area. The avos is in the public area. It doesn't matter. I mean, Rashi says that they're not in the public area. They're in the pasture. It doesn't really matter where they are so much. But you could see that most of the avos is in this public area here, except one end is in the area that's enclosed for the wells, which is inside these two corners. This is illustration 135, and so that's the case it's talking about. That there you can only spill into that, and you can and let the animals come, but you can't directly give them to drink. Okay, that's what that Braita was talking about. And what's the concern there? Gezerah dilma hazelela evus temekalkel va'atel takuneh. That maybe you're going to see something going wrong with the trough, and you're going to go and try to fix it. You're going to see some blockage in the trough or something like that. You're going to go carrying your bucket that you were directly giving the animal to drink from your bucket. You're going to go right. You're allowed to just dump it into the trough. But if you're carrying it, you're going to go around and you're going to go fix it. And you're going to carry the bucket with you, then you have a problem. Okay, so that's the way that Abaye is interpreting it. So, but then the Gemara asks, but wait a second, right? So, but would that carrying of the bucket really even be a problem? Rav Safra said that Rabbi Ami said that Rabbi Yochanan said, that if a person is carrying from one corner to another in their house, and then they walked outside into the public domain, they're exempt because they didn't pick up the object with the thought that they were going to carry it outside. They were just carrying something around their house, and they forgot that they had it in their hand, and they walked outside and put it down outside. So the original picking up of the object wasn't done for the purpose of transferring it outside. And so to here, you were picking up the bucket in order to help the animal. Okay, you were holding the bucket and
pour into the trough.
Right, but you didn't just pour it. You were actually holding it and giving the animal to drink over. Maybe you were leaning over or something like that as the animal was leaning over, because you're allowed to pour into it, but what you're not allowed to do is lean over and allow the animal to drink from your bucket. Okay, because we don't want you holding the bucket. We want you to just fill it and put it down and be done with it. Because as long as you're involved with the animal and leaning over there holding the bucket, we're concerned that you're going to see something in the trough that needs to be repaired, and you're going to walk around it, and you're going to fix it, and you're going to carry the bucket with you. But the point is that since you didn't pick up the bucket initially in order to carry it into the public domain, why are you liable anyway? So the answer is that The concern is actually that what you're going to do is you're going to walk over to the public domain to fix the animal's situation. Okay, with the bucket, you're going to put the bucket down in the public domain as you're doing what you need to do, and then you're going to carry it back. And when you carry it back, you're picking it up and walking into the private domain on purpose. Right? So that's what we're concerned about. So this is basically defending the position. This started out with the question saying that it's obvious that if you're carrying the bucket but you're not restraining the animal, that you certainly can't do it. That unless the animal's majority and its head are inside the enclosure. Right? If it's restrained and you're holding the bucket, that was the question they were discussing. If it's restrained and you're holding the bucket, does it need to have its majority inside the enclosure or not? That was what was being discussed. And so we brought this case from the case of the animal leaning over, but that's a special case that we can't really compare to our case. So we didn't answer it. But now, Ika Damre, there's a totally alternative version of this discussion which sounds almost exactly the same, but it's slightly different. Gabe Adam Hu Damrinan, so we're sort of starting over again. Gabe Adam Hu Damrinan. We know that with a person, his head and the majority of his body have to be in the domain he's drinking in. But is it enough for the animal? So this time we're not saying, is it necessary for the animal? The language is different. Is it enough for the animal to have its head and its majority inside the enclosed well area for it to drink? Is it enough? Not is it required, is it enough? Different language. Okay? So that's the question. Okay? So when you're holding the bucket and you're holding the animal, in other words, it's restrained. This is different. What it's saying now is that if you're holding the bucket and the animal is restrained, then definitely, as long as its head and the majority are inside, it's good. So previously we were asking, if you're holding the bucket and the animal is restrained, does it even need to be within the enclosure fully? Does it need to have its majority in the enclosure? Now we're saying, as long as you have two conditions, it's restrained and its majority is in the enclosure, it's good. So it's sort of answered. In this version, we're taking as our assumption that it must have its head and the majority of its body inside the enclosure in all cases. Even in the best case scenario where it's restrained, it needs that. So we're rejecting the first version, entertain the possibility that if it's restrained, it wouldn't have to be that far into the enclosure. Because it's restrained, it's not going to move. Okay, but what if you're not restraining the animal? And so now what we're really asking is it enough for it that its head and the majority of its body are inside if it's not restrained? Or does it always have to be restrained? That's a different question than before, where we said if it's restrained, it doesn't even have to have the majority of its body in. What about if it's not restrained? Okay, then, and in that case we said that if it has the majority of its body in, it sounded like from the first version, if it had the majority of its body and its head in, that even if it's not restrained, it should be okay. Now we're saying no, it always has to have the majority of its body and head in, even if it's restrained. And if it's not restrained, maybe even that's not good enough. To have the majority of its body in is not good enough. So Amar Leitznitua, we already learned this. He said that it said that the cow has to have its head and the majority of its body inside the enclosure in order to drink. Isn't that saying that even in a case where it's unrestrained, having the majority of its body in is enough? No, we're going to say that that's talking about where it is restrained. So v'hachim nami mistabra, and it makes sense that way. The eat nakat mana v'la nakatla, because if you're holding the bucket but you're not restraining the animal, even if its majority and its head are inside the enclosure, misharei, will it be permitted at all? V'hatanyam lo yimalei adam mayim. That didn't we read in a Braita that if you're allowed to put water in front of an animal, but you're not allowed to hold it in front of the animal. You have to spill it out and let the animal come take it itself. And isn't that talking about clearly an animal that's unrestrained? And even though its head and the majority of its body are in the enclosure, it's no good? In other words, it has to have two conditions. It has to be restrained and it has to be head and majority inside. Ha'itmar Allah, no, that doesn't prove anything, because as we said, Amar Abaye, Hacha be'ivus ha'omed b'reshut rabim, gavo 10 tfachim, ve'rochav 4, ve'rosho nechnas leben abasin. D'zimnin dechazei le'ivus d'mekalkel v'atei l'takunei, v'darei le'ledavla b'hadei, v'kamapek mereshut ha'yachid l'reshut rabim. In other words, Abaye already clarified that this Baraita is talking about the specific case of the evus, the trough that is it's resting in the Reshut HaRabim. Its other side is in the enclosure. You're filling it from the enclosure. It itself is a Reshut HaYachid because it's tall enough and wide enough to be a Reshut HaYachid. So you're just pouring from one Reshut HaYachid to another. The animal might be in the Reshut HaRabim or might not be, but the body of the rest of the vessel is in the Reshut HaRabim. And the concern is you might walk around to fix it and play with it. That's why all you're allowed to do is pour in there and put the bucket down. You're not allowed to be continually involved as the animal is drinking. You have to just pour and leave. So what do we see from there? We see from there that that case, that Braita, is not going to shed any light on our case, because our case is talking about where the animal is actually coming into the enclosure directly, and we want to know how much of the animal has to be in the enclosure. So, and again, we said that the reason why this was a concern was because you might bring the bucket from the Pasei Beraot, from the enclosed area, into the Reshut HaRabim. But then the Gemara asks, would that really be a problem if you brought the bucket from the enclosure to the public domain? We already read this before. That didn't we say that if you picked up the item the first time, not for the intent of bringing it outside, that you can't be liable? So, so basically what we're saying is like exactly the same thing that we said before, that we're concerned that you might bring the bucket into the Reshut HaRabim to fix things, put it down, then pick it up again and bring it back into the Reshut HaYachid. That's what we're concerned about. Okay? So in other words, we can't prove anything, but the difference between the first and second version is that in the second version they're wondering if even having its head and the majority is enough without it being restrained, or if it has to be restrained no matter what. Right? So, but everybody agrees that its head and the majority of its body will have to be in the enclosure. The question just is being unrestrained allowed? The first version said if it's restrained, no problem at all. If it's unrestrained, that's when you need it to have its head and the majority of its body inside. Right? That's when you require that. If it's restrained, maybe you wouldn't require it. The second version says you definitely require it to have its head and the majority of its body in. The question is if even an unrestrained animal is ever allowed to drink, even if its majority is inside the enclosure. So you need the two things. You need it to be restrained and you need it to be inside. So Tashma, come and listen. If the head and the majority of your camel is inside the enclosure, so ovesinoto, you can stuff it, you can fill it with a lot of food. This is a difficulty with the first version. The first version said if it's restrained, it doesn't have to have its head and the majority of its body inside. This is saying that if the camel's head and the majority of its body are inside, you can force feed it. But force feeding it is definitely restraining the animal. Right? So how can you force feed the animal? Why does it require the majority of the body to be inside if you're telling me that if it's restrained, according to the first version, if it's restrained, the head and the majority don't have to be inside the enclosure? So the Gemara answers very simply, Amar Rav Acha bar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Sheshet, Rav Acha bar Rav Huna Rav Acha bar Rav Huna says that Rav Sheshet says, Shani Gamal, a Gamal is different, a camel is different, Hoil v'tzavro aruch, because it has a long neck. So even if it's restrained, it's going to move, it's going to turn. So that's why you have to make sure that its head and the majority of its body are inside the enclosure. Because even with some restraint, it could still move about, and you might still end up trailing it into the public domain. Tashma, come and listen. That if you have an animal that its head and the majority of its body are inside the enclosure, you can force feed it in the enclosure. So again, you see that even though you're force feeding, which means you're restraining the animal, it has to have its head and the majority of its body inside. That's like the second version, not like the first version.
That's how you both feed your dry.
Right. Yeah, you need both conditions. So the problem is that this seems to refute the first version. So and it's not talking about a camel; it's talking about an animal. So the Gemara says, "Mai behema nami tekatani gamal." It must be talking about a camel. So the Gemara says, but we had two different teachings. One teaching was an animal, one teaching said gamal. One teaching said animal, one teaching said camel. So midi gabeha dedetanya. Were they taught in the same text? If they're taught in the same text, obviously you're not going to use two different words for the same thing. But when you're teaching, when they were taught independently, in one case the person was making a more general statement, calling it an animal, and in the other one, right? There's no contrast in that statement because they're two different statements. One was specific and said a gamal. One was more general and generic and said animal, but really it also meant a camel. And Tanya Namiyachi, we can also see that that's the case because Rabbi Eliezer oser bagamal ho'il v'tzavaro aroch, because it says in that braita right there that Rabbi Eliezer forbids you with a gamal, with a camel, because its neck is long. So what do you see from that? You see that the term animal could refer to, in certain cases, to a camel. That a camel was under discussion, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer is coming along and saying that having the camel, and Rashi explains, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, even if the camel is restrained, and even if its majority of its body and its head are inside the enclosure, we're still concerned that it could move itself into the public domain, despite being restrained and despite being far in. So Rabbi Eliezer will never allow you to force feed a camel on Shabbat because of this concern when you're standing, when you're bordering the public domain like that. He's not going to allow you to do it. But what you see is that the term behemah, the term animal in the Braita, certainly could be referring to gamal. It certainly could be referring to camel because they were talking about camel as a particular case of concern that needed to be discussed. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer refers to it specifically as camel. But in both Braitot, where it's speaking of the problem, the issue of needing it to be restrained and to have the majority of its body and its head inside the enclosure, could only be talking about a camel. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying, with a camel, even with both conditions met, it wouldn't be allowed because we're concerned it will still pull away from you.